When I first started getting into ICM in Iowa and going out on a regular basis with my camera, I read this book by David Duchemin, who's another Canadian photographer, A Beautiful Anarchy. And in that book, he talks about this idea, which isn't a new concept necessarily, but he talks about this idea that you have to get out and do the work. You can't wait for inspiration to hit. You have to get out and do the work, and it's in the doing of the work that inspiration comes. And so when I read this book and I started going out into the landscape in Iowa, that made me realize that getting out to do that work was going to be important for me to evolve my artistry and to evolve my creative expression. And so over the years, since 2017, I've worked in a number of different ways with my camera. I started out working with single exposure ICMs, and then I moved on to doing multiple exposure ICMs, and then in the past couple of years, I've been pushing the boundaries of that. I'm always looking to push the boundaries of the work that I do. I never want to stay in one place with my artistry. I always want to be evolving and growing and pushing beyond what I've done before. And so these are all single exposure ICMs. And like I said, that's what I started out doing first, was single exposure. So it's just one exposure in the camera, moving the camera during the exposure, usually a longer shutter speed, something around a half a second is what I like to use as far as a shutter speed. And I'll just run through a few examples here of some single exposure ICMs. These are just grasses in front of some trees. And trees are a great way to get started with ICM if you've never done them before. But I was always trying to find new and different ways to really move my camera to create different kinds of effects. And every situation, every scene is going to be different. And you can't necessarily always predict what's going to happen with ICM. And sometimes you might end up needing, or not needing, I shouldn't say that. You might sometimes shoot or take hundreds of exposures, and you may only come back with one or two that actually work for you, but that's just the nature of it. And I'm very process-driven. I'm more process-driven than I am results-driven. So if I go out and I take 800 exposures and I come back and only have one or two out of that I want to share or that I want to, post on social media, I'm okay with that because I enjoyed being immersed in the moment and immersed in the process. And all of those 798 other exposures that I took, they just helped move me along. They helped move me further down the road, and they helped me hone my technique and my abilities and my processes. And so I never look at failures. I never look at my images as failures. A lot of people will say, oh, I have such a high failure to success ratio, or they'll say, I've got 600 failures, and I just don't think of it that way. 600 images that don't necessarily work as far as wanting to post them or publish them or share them, that doesn't mean they were failures. They were part of the process, and there's no failure in just being a part of the process. And so that's how I approach my work, is that I think everything is valuable and everything is pushing me further down the road of my artistry, down the path of my journey, my creative journey. So in 2022, after having focused on single exposures for several years, I got this itch. I needed to do more. I didn't feel like I was creating anything new that I hadn't seen myself do before. And also, when I started doing ICM in 2017, there weren't a lot of people really doing it. And so once I started to see more and more people doing ICM, and I started to see more and more people creating images that that looked somewhat like the images I was creating, I felt it was time to move forward. I needed something more with my camera work. And so I started working with multiple exposure ICM. And when I say multiple exposure ICM, what I mean by that is that I'm generally moving the camera for all of those exposures. You know, people have been doing multiple exposure just of straight subjects or straight multiple exposures for a long time, but I hadn't seen very many people who were actually moving the camera for each of the exposures, working with multiple exposure. And then working with different blend modes, like bright and dark blend mode. Those really give you the ability to be very creative and create very artistic images with your camera. So having that ability to start pushing my own boundaries, I started working to hone this multiple exposure ICM technique. And so this is one where I have actually turned the camera upside down. That's something that I do quite a lot, is that I will do one exposure with the camera right side up, and then I flip the camera upside down and I move the camera for the second exposure. And that way, especially in bright blend mode, I'm bringing the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. And so I've spent a lot of time really getting out into the environment and playing with these techniques as well. This one I really love. This is a favorite one of my images, and it actually looks like a winter scene. And that's one of the things, another one of the ways that we can tap into the landscape of imagination, because when you look at this particular image, it looks like a winter scene. It looks like trees and snow. But this was taken in the middle of July in Santa Fe. So summer shot in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's trees where I've done a vertical wavy sort of motion of the trees, flipped the camera upside down and done a wavy horizontal motion. And that brings, again, in bright blend mode, that brightness of the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. And it gives that effect that the trees are in snow. It gives that kind of wintry effect. So, you know, you can really be creative with these techniques. Again, and this one is in dark blend mode, and this is one that was just in a shop window inside of a strip mall. And so you can play with any subject, really, with ICM. That's the beauty of this as well, is that any subject really is game with ICM. I've seen people create amazing imagery with just things, clutter on their desk, or things in their colorful trash in their garbage bin. You're really only limited by your own imagination when it comes to these techniques of ICM and multiple exposure. And again, dark blend mode. This one is in dark blend mode, and I just really love the way that I can create these images that feel like paintings, especially with dark blend mode. And so this one is bright blend mode again, where I've turned the camera upside down. And, you know, it's, again, just a really creative way of being able to express yourself and not creating images that represent anything literal, as I've mentioned. When I look at the images myself, I know where I was when I took those images or when I created those images, and so they hold special meaning for me of the experience that I felt in that particular moment, rather than looking at it and saying, oh yeah, I was there, and you can tell where I was because of the literal lines of the subject. That's not how I want to create. This one has a little bit more recognizability, maybe. This is on the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan skyline. But again, it is more abstract, and it is, you know, expressing myself in a way that it just shows how I felt and what I was seeing in that particular moment. So this one I think you've probably all seen on the advertising, the marketing for the Rarefied Light. This was local to me. This was in Iowa. We do sometimes get a lot of snow, and I love to be out in the snow. I never wait for perfect light. I never wait for perfect conditions. I never wait for anything. if I feel the need to be creative, I just get out and I start playing with my camera no matter what time of year, what time of day, what the conditions are. And I especially do actually love to be out in the winter in the snow. And this one was a really magical moment for me when I created this particular image as well. And so in early 2024, I started to go through this sort of, after 2 years of working with multiple exposure, ICM, creating in the camera, doing all of this work in the camera, I had worn it actually as a badge of honor that I've been able to create all of those things that you just saw in my camera. I did not do any Photoshop on those. I wore that as a sort of a badge of honor, and I had limited myself actually to using Photoshop. I had set some self-imposed limitations that I wouldn't allow myself to learn how to use Photoshop because I wanted to do all of the work in the camera. But in early 2024, I started to feel that itch again. I'm not doing anything new with my multiple exposure ICMs. What's next? What can I do now? Because I need to move forward. I need to create something new and different. And so I went through this period of really deep questioning. I kind of felt like it was an existential crisis, actually. And so I learned through that period that I had been placing, and I don't know why that slide looks like that, because it's got the words underneath the images. It's not like that on my original version, but I just realized that I had been placing limitations on myself, not to allow myself the ability to take my images into Photoshop. I still love to create in the camera, and I still will do as much of the work in the camera as possible, but I have learned that I can take some of my images that I do create in the camera, my multiple exposure ICMs, for example, into Photoshop, and I can start playing with layers and blending modes in Photoshop and working with brushes and things like that. Things I can't do in the camera, and that has opened up a whole new way of thinking and a whole new a realm of creativity for me over the past year and a half as well. And in the process of this, because I did found and create the ICM Photography magazine, which has always been focused on intentional camera movement, I felt like, am I outgrowing my own magazine, or can my magazine evolve with me? And so in the process of all of this self-reflection, I decided that I wanted to redefine ICM to mean intentional creative moments. And that way, that opens up the ability for me to publish work that isn't maybe necessarily strictly ICM, but it can publish work from photographers and artists around the world that pushes the boundaries beyond just that. You know, ICM is a technique, and I want to move beyond just a specific technique and focus more on creativity. And so redefining ICM as intentional creative moments, to me, ICM just in general, I think, can be a gateway or a bridge for a lot of people to move into more creative techniques with their cameras. And so certainly ICM, I don't want to change the name of ICM Photography magazine, but I wanted a way to open the door to celebrate the work of more than just that singular technique. So that's my new vision, to redefine ICM. And so also in the process of all of this self-evaluation, I started pushing my own boundaries. I started layering in the camera, using ICM and then putting straight shots on top of my ICMs, which is something I had never allowed myself to do. I felt like I'm an ICM photographer, I've got to do all ICM. But when I started to realize that that was limiting me, I started playing around with these techniques of, I can select images from my memory card, and then I can go in and use that as the base image for a new multiple exposure sequence, and I can add on to it. So in a sense, now a lot of times I feel like when I'm out with my camera, I'm giving myself permission to collect elements as I'm going along my path or my journey when I'm out with my camera. And then playing with a lens baby. I bought a lens baby last year. I started playing with that. If any of you don't know what that is, it's a specialty lens. It's sort of like a macro lens, but it has some special features that you don't get. You don't get some of the same kinds of soft blur around the edges with a macro lens that you might get with, say, a lens baby Velvet 85. So I started playing with that, and then I learned how to do cyanotypes last year. And then after learning how to do cyanotypes, I thought, well, what if I blended some of those cyanotype prints with my camera work? And so again, just always trying to find ways to push the boundaries of my artistry and my creativity. And so this section here, I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of creating layers in cameras and in the camera. And we will go into all of this in more detail in the workshop, of course, but by having the ability in my camera to select images from the memory card to start a new multiple exposure sequence, I can go out in an environment and just start playing. And if I like trees, I love to play with trees, and I love just the sinuous lines of doing vertical movement with trees. And so I can go out into a woodland area, do several single exposures of the trees, and then as I'm walking along the trail or the path and I see some colorful flowers, I might think, oh, what if I put those flowers on top of those trees? So that's kind of the concept here, where I have used a single exposure ICM of some trees and then added some flowers on top of those trees. And then working with this rotational effect where I'm moving the camera in between exposures and again selecting images from the memory card to add on top. This is probably, I would say, 17 exposures total. And you can't do that in one go, in one multiple exposure frame. You would have to do that either in Photoshop as layers or by being able to select images from your memory card and adding on top of that. So again, just some more examples of this concept of layering in the camera. I still, like I said, I'm enjoying working in Photoshop, and I've created some really beautiful, amazing things, I think, in Photoshop, but I still get a lot of joy. Most of the joy comes from actually being out with my camera. So this is, again, another one of those that concept of layering images in the camera. And I think, this is pushing the boundaries. This is work that I hadn't ever done before I started allowing myself to just play in this way of adding sharp elements on top of ICM images. Because, again, like I said, I'd always been pretty adamant about sticking to this idea that I was moving the camera for everything and not having anything straight. But I really like the ability to create these abstract works where I'm combining elements. Sometimes, they might be on the same walk, but they're going to be completely different elements. Like, for this particular image, the ICM is just grasses and trees, but the rotational effect of the image, the part that you see that's sharper, those are just clover on the ground somewhere else down the trail. So a lot of things that you can do with this layering in the camera technique as well. And then this one here, what I loved about this is a cabin. This is just an ordinary old historic cabin. And by using that technique, the multiple exposure ICM, for one set for one image, and then selecting that as the base image, and then layering on some little white flowers that happen to be in the area. That gives the impression that there's snow here, but this was in April. This was in the Smoky Mountains, so you can create the impression of things that don't really exist in the world when you're using these techniques. And so this just leads me to the idea of the art of allowing, because, I had not given myself permission, like I said before, to do a lot of these things that I'm showing you in this latter part of the presentation. But once I opened myself up and realized I had placed these limitations on myself, and that I, was stifling my own creativity, essentially. I was stifling my own creativity by not allowing myself to do certain types of things. Once I allowed myself that freedom, it just really took me in a whole new direction with my artistry and my creativity. And so now I am doing a lot of creative post-processing of my camera-based work. I'm doing a lot of camera-less photography through cyanotype prints, and then I'm blending those two processes together. So I'm blending analog and digital together. This next section is just going to be a few of the images where I have taken this would happen to be multiple exposure ICM images that I took into Photoshop and layered and played with some of the different blending modes. But you can see how this pushes even beyond what I could create in the camera in a lot of ways. I could probably create this in the camera. I think I could probably create this in the camera, but I didn't see it in that particular moment, so it only came to me in the process of working with layers in Photoshop. And just giving myself that permission to be able to do that. This was in Albuquerque at the museum in Albuquerque, and this was just a compilation of several different images that I took in the Albuquerque museum, and I couldn't do this in the camera. I don't think there's any way I could do this in the camera, but I loved the way things came together with the colors and the lines and the geometry of this particular image. This was early on when I first started playing with Photoshop, and I got a little crazy with brushes, but I love brushes, and so you can see all the brush marks that I made in each of these images. And these two images actually started from the same multiple exposure ICM image. So that's the other thing with this creative post-processing, is that you can take one image and you can turn it into multiple different kinds of images by playing around in Photoshop and trying different ways of manipulating the layers and trying different blending modes. This one also was in Albuquerque at the museum there, and I just remember there was an exhibition, or it was an exhibition, and it was about our land, and it was based on the indigenous peoples that live in Santa Fe and New Mexico. And I don't know, there was something that I was just trying to get that our land to come through with my ICM. But then when I took it into Photoshop and started layering it and blending it with other images, I really liked that was able to still come through. So there's a lot of things you can play with in Photoshop to bring your vision to life, to bring out your creative vision, maybe more so than when you're working in the field with the camera. All of the images started out in the camera, but then I took them into Photoshop, like I mentioned. This is just a simple subject. This is a lamp on my fireplace mantle, and so you can play with simple objects that you have in your own home and allowing yourself that freedom. I never previously would have thought about just playing around with a lamp on my fireplace mantle, but by doing that and then taking the photos into Photoshop and working with layers and brushes, I was able to create these two different images. And then this one also is one of my favorites, working in Photoshop again, combining some straight shots of a particular feature on the University of Iowa campus near where I live, along with some multiple exposure ICMs. This one, when I started to see this coming together in Photoshop, it just reminded me of pyramids, So again, it's that tapping into the landscape of imagination, because this was just sandstone in Northumberland. And it didn't look anything like this in the original image, but when I took that one image into Photoshop and started duplicating it on top of itself and rotating it, each of the layers around to build these pyramids, I couldn't have done that in the camera. And then a couple more here. The image on the right is one that I felt like I was creating a school of fish that was going around in a circle. And so it's a lot of fun to play in Photoshop, and I don't regret that I had not allowed myself the ability to play in Photoshop before now, before I started doing it in 2024, because I think it's all part of the journey, it's all part of the process, and I had to get to that point where I was ready for it. We can't just jump right into things necessarily unless we're ready for them. If we're not ready for them, they're not going to land on us. They're not going to resonate for us in the same way as they will when we're ready for it. So after having done all of that work, I finally was ready to play in Photoshop. And so this is another one that's just a simple object. It's a floor lamp in my daughter's living room. And each of these images really feels like a celebration to me, with the way all of the different elements come together. And each of these images, I would say, is probably about 75 exposures total when you count up how many multiple exposure images I layered together in Photoshop. So again, not something that I could really do in the camera. And then this idea of blending ICM with cyanotypes. I had been intrigued by cyanotypes for a long time, but I thought it was a really complicated process. And when I really finally was ready for it, I started looking into it more, and I realized I had been making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not as complicated as it seems to be. And so I started playing with cyanotypes, and this is where you're painting cyanotype chemistry, photos or light-sensitive chemistry onto paper or any substrate. You can use any substrate. I use watercolor paper. You paint that chemistry onto the paper, and then you can put botanical elements on top of that, put it out into the sun, and then it will expose to give you the outline of those botanical elements. And so there's a lot of different ways you can work with cyanotypes: dry cyanotype, wet cyanotype, wet on dry or wet on wet cyanotypes, and I try to work with all of those different types. And so these are dry cyanotypes. These have a very distinctive blue color, and that's what you will see when you look up cyanotype. Most of the time you're going to see images that have this very distinctive Prussian blue color. But when you start playing around with wet elements on your cyanotype prints, you can alter the color of those blues. You can start to push the colors and create different kinds of blues, different tones and different colors. And so these are just some more. These are wet. I think these were wet on dry here. But I just had this idea, what if I start to blend my cyanotypes with some of my camera work, some of my multiple exposure ICMs? What would happen? And really all of this is tapping into the landscape of imagination. Really is just a matter of asking yourself always, what if? What if I do this? What if I do that? What if I try that? What will happen? And nothing's going to be a failure, because it's all just part of the process. It's all leading you down the road until you have those breakthroughs. Sometimes those breakthroughs come unexpectedly. And when I started layering these ICMs and multiple exposures with the cyanotypes, I just thought, wow, this is something I've never seen before. I've never seen anyone else doing, and not to say that I'm the only one or that I'm the first, because surely someone else has thought about it. There's nothing new under the sun, they say. But when I started doing it, I just fell in love with that ability to create something with my hands, something tactile with the cyanotypes with my hands, but then also blend them with the artistry that I create in the camera as well. And so, my trajectory has taken a great turn over the past couple of years with the way that I work with my photos, whether they're cyanotypes or whether they're work that I do in the camera. And so, again, just being very deliberate in trying to place certain things in certain parts of the frame here, because these were alliums actually. And so the ICM, multiple exposure ICM that I did was of a rotation effect of a flower. So I was trying to get those flowers placed precisely in the center of those alliums. And that I had to do, of course, in Photoshop. But if I hadn't been doing the creative post-processing leading up to this, I wouldn't have really known how to do that. So it's all just been part of this evolving journey for me. And just another one here, cyanotype with multiple exposure blended. This one I really like because I like the way this is actually that cover image at the beginning of the presentation. That's this image blended with a cyanotype. And I just loved the way that those colors came through in this particular one here. And so I guess just in closing, because we are getting close to the 1 hour mark, I just want to encourage you to think about your creative journey as an ongoing process, that it's something that happens over time. It doesn't just all happen at once. You have to put in the work, like that book from David Duchemin, Do the Work. You have to do the work. And I've done a prolific amount of work over the past 8 years. I have over 300,000 images in my Lightroom catalog. I hear some ICM photographers, creative photographers say, "Oh, I've got 20,000 images in my Lightroom catalog," and they think that's a lot, and I'm just like, I've got 300,000. But anyway, start wherever you are, too. You just have to start where you are. Don't get ahead of yourself. When you're ready for that next step, you'll know it. And for me, it's always been that way as well. I just always know instinctively when it's time to move forward, when it's time to try something else, try something new. And so allow that process to lead you and guide you. And don't, try not to put limitations on yourself. Of course, we all do that. But when you're pushing the boundaries, you really are moving forward, I feel like. They say that you don't grow outside if you're inside the box. If you stay inside the box, you don't grow. You only grow by stepping outside of the box, by expanding your horizons. So moving forward is an important aspect of all of this. And self-evaluation and questioning, I think, is important. If I didn't take the time over the years to stop and think about what it is that I want from my artistry, and am I utilizing all of the tools that I have available to me to the fullest extent, which I hadn't been, but it took self-evaluation to realize that and to accept and acknowledge that. And then once you accept it and acknowledge it, then you know that you can move forward. And just remain constantly open to creativity. There's a creative spirit that wants to flow through you. There's an artistry that wants to come through you. Each of you has your own unique artistry that wants to come through you, and it can only come through you in that particular way. So just be open to that. Be open to being, creating art, making art that is what instinctively wants to come through you. And so, you can see here on this slide the kind of the trajectory, the moving through the landscape, how my work has evolved from the single exposure to the multiple exposure to layering in the camera to layering in Photoshop and blending with the digital and the analog techniques. It's come a long way since 2017 when I first started doing single exposure ICMs, and I never could have imagined then that I'd be standing here today talking to all of you about these processes and these techniques. But I do appreciate that, someone had that faith and confidence in me to come here and give this public lecture, and hopefully I haven't fumbled it up too much. But this is something I want to show you. These last few slides are some things I want to show you because I did come here a few days early, and I have been out and about. I went to Denali, and I hiked to Portage Glacier Lake. I went to the museum. I went to the botanical garden. I took a boat tour to the Kenai Fjord Peninsula. And I'm taking my camera out with me on all of these excursions, and I'm creating in the moment. I don't usually look at my images when I travel until after I get home, and I definitely don't ever edit them while I'm traveling, but I wanted to show you what I've been up to. And these are just a small handful. So this was at in the garden outside of the Anchorage Museum. This is that layering in the camera technique. And certainly if you don't have the ability in your camera to select images from your memory card, you could still create something like this by layering in Photoshop, by doing the single exposure of the trees and then taking several flower pictures and then layering them together in Photoshop. But this I did in the moment, in the camera, outside the garden, outside the museum in the garden. And I love the color of the flowers here. When I was at home, all the flowers are just yellow or white. And when I was in the Smoky Mountains, even in April, all of the flowers there were yellow or white. So having pink and purple flowers here has been a real treat. And I love bringing those in to these images here. So they just have a really kind of fantasy look and feel to them. But this was inside the museums. This is in the atrium area inside the museum, using multiple exposure. I think just 2 exposures of the stairs that come down in the atrium there. This was at the Botanical Garden, and just again playing with some single exposure of trees and adding on top some flowers to create a whimsical look and feel there. And then this was Portage Glacier. It probably doesn't do it justice on this screen, but I just love that blue color and the immenseness of that location to me. This feels like what I felt in that particular moment. And then also the flowers on the beach there at the lake. In front of the glacier. So taking one of those multiple exposure ICMs of the glacier and then adding some of those flowers from the beach on top of that to create that particular image. And I have been doing some cyanotypes while I've been here as well. So I went out to Kincaid Beach and I did some cyanotypes there. I brought coated paper with me. I coated a bunch of paper at home and then brought it with me so that I could go out and do some of these environmental cyanotypes. So they're more abstract, not using any botanical elements, but just working with water and sand and mud. And in this particular image on the right there that you see, that one was at Portage Glacier Lake, and there were chunks of ice that kept coming up to the beach, and so I just would take some big chunks of ice and break them up and put them on top of the cyanotypes to see what would happen. So those are those cyanotypes, but these are probably 3 of my favorite. I did also, I think the one on the far right I did at Denali next to the Savage River when I was walking the Savage River Loop. But these are very abstract versions that I was really happy with the way that those were turning out when I was doing those out on location in the moment. So finding ways to create in these different ways, like, cyanotypes, in non-traditional ways, in the moment, on location, is something that I really am keen to continue to do more and more of. So, if you want to connect with me, my website is stephjohnphoto.com. I'm on social media at Facebook and Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. Everything is Steph John Photo. So if you just look up Steph John Photo, you should find me. There's a lot of Stephanie Johnson photographies out there in the world, but there's only one Steph John Photo.